Hey guitar people! This is a 2009 Danelectro 59 dual cut reissue. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but basically this is a quote-unquote reissue of the classic Danelectro model 3021, which was made from 1959 onwards. If you can tell by the piece that I let in with here, it was kind of made famous by a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Page in a little old band called Led Zeppelin. What this is it's a very cheap kind of a guitar. It was intended to put guitars in the hands of the average family, and those families being the ones that were not very heavily into music performance, where perhaps the parents really couldn't justify or didn't see the worth in paying lots of money for a Gibson guitar for their kid, or even a Fender at half the price. These were made by a company called Danelectro, which was started in 1947, and the company was started by a gentleman by the name of Nathan Daniel, and his goal was to produce guitars of reasonable tone at very low prices. The company was started in Neptune, New Jersey, and after manufacturing initially amplifiers for catalog companies like Sears Roebuck and Company, Montgomery Ward, and companies like that, he went into producing solid body electric guitars. Later in the 1950s, he started producing some hollow and semi-hollow body electric guitars. This is an example of that. The body itself is hollow with a center block of poplar to mount the pickups and the bridge hardware and the neck pocket and all that stuff to give it a solid surface. The body shell itself is made out of masonite. If you don't know what masonite is, go to Office Max or Staples or Office Depot and buy yourself one of those cheap brown clipboards with the spring clip at the top. That brown material, that pressed wood fiber, which is basically scrap from lumber construction and things like that, that's been pressed together under heat with water and glue, that's masonite, and that's what these are made out of. It's a very cheap material. As long as you don't let it soak and delaminate, it's very lightweight and strong. It is certainly not what a cork sniffer would refer to as a tone wood, although technically it is a wood product. Decoratively, this white strip around the edge of the guitar provides a nice visual contrast to the dark color of the shell, but its original purpose was more functional than that. In the 1950s, when these guitars were first being produced, they couldn't make the masonite shell out of a single piece. They had to make it out of two halves and glue those two halves together, and this white tape, this white vinyl tape around the edge, hid that ugly glue seam so that the guitar had a more presentable, clean looking appearance. These sold again out of Sears and Montgomery Ward and JCPenney and that sort of catalog. They were manufactured under the brand names of Danelectro, Silvertone, and Airline, among others. Danelectro pioneered a number of types of guitars of the electric sort, such as baritone guitars with a longer scale neck, 12-string electric guitars, and convertible guitars that could be switched back and forth from being I'll call it a quote-unquote acoustic guitar and an electric guitar. So they, although cheap, did have a lot of thinking behind their products and some attempts at innovation. In the mid-1960s, the company was sold off to a big conglomerate, and they produced dwindling quantities of electric guitars up until probably about 2001. Around 2001 they stopped making guitars. By then they were well past having been made in the US, having been made overseas for many number of years. In 2006 or so, the new ownership of the conglomerate that owned the Danelectro brand decided that they wanted to go to market with cheaper guitars again. At that time they were only selling cheap effects pedals. So their strategy at that point forward was to produce limited quantities of guitars every year, and they've been doing that by revisiting their original classic models. This is a 2009 reissue of a 1959 model, so it is a 50th anniversary reissue. Unfortunately, these being the cheap garage sale guitars that they are, there really isn't a lot on this guitar that would tell you that it's a reissue other than the features itself, and there isn't anything distinguishing on the guitar that tells you what year it was, even though it was kind of a milestone year for this model. The serial number itself was just a sticker that as I was buffing the guitar came off, and I couldn't re-stick it back on. So I've lost the serial number to the sands of time, if you will. The guitar itself in 2009 had been switched to production in China, and to make it seem like a vintage guitar, they applied a matte finish to the whole guitar, body, hardware, everything. So what you see here with some reflections and whatnot is the result of hours of me hand wet sanding this to get it back to some semblance of a glossy finish. It had that dull kind of a matte finish, which I don't really care for it, and quite honestly it doesn't make it look like a vintage guitar because it's too even and too uniform. On a really old guitar that it has worn like that, you're gonna have dull spots and bright spots on it depending on how the wear patterns were. So it looks incredibly fake to me. The guitar has a very interesting kind of a clean tone. Unfortunately, I am in a weird tuning to play the piece that I introed with, so I don't know the chords really well in this tuning. It's Dadgad tuning, which is kind of an open Celtic tuning. That's it's an interesting tuning, but it's I don't want to say it's abstract because people have heard of it, but certainly it's not something my brain goes to as far as being able to play comfortably. I just don't have the practice at it. But you can kind of hear some of the tones that are present. Very quickly, the construction of the guitar itself, as I said, it's semi-hollow. It has a bolt-on neck, which is attached with these 4 screws right in the back of the body. These 4 screws on the back of the body are the pickup height adjustment screws. They are not spring mounted. They're spaced off from the bottom of the body shell by a couple of pieces of foam. The pickups are what they call lipstick tube pickups because the original pickups were basically a coil of wire wrapped up with brown packing tape and shoved into surplus lipstick tubes and wired into the electronics of the guitar. They were actually made out of lipstick tubes, and that's why they're called that. The kind of jangly, bright kind of a tone you get out of this guitar is largely due to the pickups and this aluminum nut, which is a standard feature on most Danelectros. It does have a truss rod, but it's not adjustable up here. Like an old Fender, you have to take the neck off, and then there is an adjustment screw down at the bottom end here. It makes it a little bit inconvenient, but you know, it makes it so that the headstock is not weakened by that pocket that you have to carve out to allow for tool access. It's not 100% period correct because the tuners are individual sealed tuners. Back in the 50s, they would have been 3 in a line, or 3 per side, I should say, strip tuners. That's actually a huge improvement. It's a concession that they've made to, you know, people don't want to play crappy guitars that go out of tune all the time. So they could have put strip tuners on here, but they're generally not that great. They're exposed. Eventually they're going to get gritty. The control arrangement's pretty interesting. A very cheap toggle switch, and then these concentric knobs. On this particular run, the dark skirt of the knob controls the tone, and the white top of the knob controls the volume. The bridge is just a very simple plate of, I assume, aluminum. It's a pretty soft metal, and then screwed to that with a single screw from underneath is a rosewood saddle that can be, you can turn it either way and then tighten the screw down if you need to make a broad adjustment to your intonation. The fingerboard, being that this is made in China and not subject to the same sorts of environmental regulations, if I can speak here, that American guitars are, this is probably the nicest piece of rosewood I have ever seen on any of my guitars, and that includes things like from the Gibson Custom Shop. It is just an incredible piece of rosewood. An American company would usually take a piece of wood like that, set it aside, and charge you extra to put it on one of their hand-selected models. In China, they don't care. This wood is just in the pile of wood, and it got slapped on this neck, and it ended up on my guitar in my house. So kind of luck of the draw, but very rarely, although I have had that happen with another Gibson guitar, very rarely do you get a piece of wood that is this aesthetically nice looking. That's about it for this guitar. I mean, it's a very simple kind of a thing. Again, it's semi-hollow body, and I purchased this for about $400 in 2009. I believe they go for a similar amount of money now, but as I said, Danelectro tends to make limited quantities of these every year, so you know, after the NAMM show is probably the best time to take a look for these things, you know, after the winter NAMM show. And typically, you know, they'll offer these through their retailers. This is one of the models that usually gets released in some form or fashion. It's not always this exact model in this color. Sometimes it has the upgraded bridge with the intonable saddles individually on it that Jimmy Page upgraded to later. But this model is more indicative of what the original factory production model would have been like without any upgrades in the late 1950s, early 1960s. It's an interesting guitar, and you know, one of the biggest names in rock guitar ever has played this on tour on a stage. So when you think about how cheaply this is built and how hung up some people get about quality of parts, quality of materials, it's all in the player, and you know, with a little bit of care, this guitar is capable of surviving those sorts of rigors, and if not, it's cheap enough where you can just replace it really easily. I still prefer the late 90s Korean reissues because they came basically factory fresh, gloss finish, bright chrome hardware. They're just nicer to look at. The pickups on these Chinese ones tend to be a little bit on the hotter side. Depends on what kind of music you want to play, whether you like that or not. So that's all I've got for now on my Danelectro. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave a comment for me, and I'll try and answer best as I can.